I walked into my own kitchen to find his ex-wife making coffee like she owned the place, and my husband acting like this was totally normal. Let me start from the beginning because honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how my life turned into this mess. 3 weeks ago, I was living what I thought was a pretty normal married life. Sure, we had our issues like any couple, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. My husband and I had been married for 4 years, and he had 2 kids from his previous marriage, a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old who stayed with us every other weekend and Wednesday nights. The arrangement had always worked fine. His ex-wife lived about 20 minutes away, and we had a decent co-parenting relationship. Not friends exactly, but civil enough that school events and birthday parties weren't awkward battlefields. I'd even started to think of the kids as my own in some ways, helping with homework during our time together, and remembering their favorite snacks when grocery shopping. But then everything changed on a Tuesday evening in March. I was coming home from a particularly brutal day at work, looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and maybe some takeout while binge-watching something mindless on Netflix. Instead, I walked into what felt like an alternate universe. The first thing I noticed was the extra car in our driveway. Not unusual on its own, sometimes neighbors parked there when they had company. But as I got closer to the house, I could hear voices inside. Multiple voices. Adult voices. On a Tuesday night when the kids weren't supposed to be with us. I opened the front door and immediately saw suitcases in our entryway. 3 large suitcases and what looked like several boxes stacked against the wall. My first thought was that maybe my husband's sister was visiting unexpectedly, though she usually called ahead. But then I heard her voice from the kitchen. His ex-wife was talking to someone, presumably my husband, about school pickup schedules and whether the kids needed new winter coats. I stood there for a moment, completely frozen, trying to process what I was hearing. When I finally made it to the kitchen, the scene that greeted me was so surreal I almost wondered if I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. She was standing at our coffee maker that I'd bought last Christmas and that my husband had complained was too complicated to use, making what appeared to be a fresh pot. She was wearing comfortable clothes, the kind you wear when you're settling in somewhere, not the kind you wear for a quick visit. My husband was sitting at our kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of him, and both kids were there too, doing homework like this was all completely normal. The kids looked up when I walked in and greeted me with their usual enthusiasm, but there was something different in their expressions. Not guilty exactly, but like they were waiting to see how I'd react to something they knew might be surprising. My husband looked up too, and I could see in his face that he knew he had some explaining to do. But it was his ex-wife who spoke first, turning around with a coffee mug in her hands and giving me a smile that seemed genuinely warm but also somehow apologetic. She thanked me for letting her stay, and said she hoped it wouldn't be too much of an inconvenience. She hoped we could make it work for the kids' sake. I must have looked as confused as I felt because my husband finally stood up and started explaining. Apparently, his ex-wife had been having some financial difficulties. Her landlord had decided to sell the property she'd been renting, and with only 30 days' notice, she hadn't been able to find anything else she could afford in the same school district. Rather than uproot the kids in the middle of the school year, my husband had offered our guest room until she could get back on her feet. The way he explained it, it seemed like such a reasonable, compassionate solution. The kids wouldn't have to change schools or leave their friends. His ex-wife wouldn't have to move in with her parents 3 hours away. It was temporary, just until she could save up enough for a deposit on a new place, or maybe find something more affordable. But here's the thing that made my stomach drop: he'd made this decision without talking to me about it. Not a phone call during the day to give me a heads up. Not even a text message warning me that I'd be coming home to a completely different living situation. He just decided on his own that this was what we were going to do. I managed to keep my composure in front of the kids and his ex-wife, but inside I was a swirling mess of confusion, anger, and hurt. How do you react in a situation like that? Do you make a scene and look like the evil stepmother who doesn't care about the children's well-being? Do you smile and pretend everything's fine while you're internally screaming? I chose a middle path that probably satisfied no one. I said it was fine, that I understood the situation was difficult, but that my husband and I needed to talk privately later. The kids seemed relieved that there wasn't going to be any immediate drama, and his ex-wife looked grateful but also like she knew she'd been put in an awkward position. That night, after the kids were in bed and his ex-wife had retreated to what was now apparently her room, my husband and I had what might generously be called a discussion but was really more like me trying to express my feelings while he defended his decision. He kept emphasizing how temporary it was, how it was the right thing to do for the kids, how his ex-wife really was in a tough spot through no fault of her own. And honestly, I couldn't argue with any of that. It did seem like the compassionate thing to do, and the kids clearly were happier not having to deal with upheaval in their living situation. But I kept coming back to the fact that he'd made this decision without me. We were supposed to be partners, and partners discuss major changes to their living situation before they happen. Having another adult move into your home, even temporarily, is a big deal. It changes the dynamic of everything: privacy, finances, daily routines, relationship dynamics. He apologized for not talking to me first, but it was one of those apologies that felt more like he was sorry I was upset rather than sorry he'd done something wrong. He explained that the situation had come up suddenly, that his ex-wife had called him in tears after getting the eviction notice, that he'd felt like he had to give her an answer right away. Part of me understood that. When someone you care about, and he did care about his ex-wife at least as the mother of his children, is in crisis, your instinct is to help immediately. But part of me also felt like if the situation was truly that urgent, he could have at least called me to discuss it before making the offer. The first week was awkward in ways I hadn't even anticipated. It wasn't just the obvious stuff like sharing kitchen space or coordinating bathroom schedules. It was smaller things that I hadn't thought about, like how she knew exactly how my husband liked his coffee because she'd been making it for him for years before I came along, or how she automatically knew which grocery stores he preferred, and what brands of cereal the kids would actually eat. I found myself feeling like a guest in my own home, watching someone else navigate my space with a familiarity that highlighted how much shared history they had. They'd talk about things that happened during their marriage, inside jokes and references that I wasn't part of. Not in a mean way or anything, but it was a constant reminder that they built a life together before I existed in their world. The kids were happier than I'd seen them in a long time. Having both their parents in the same house, even with me there too, seemed to fulfill some deep need for family unity that I hadn't fully understood before. They were more relaxed, more open, more willing to talk about their feelings and their day. It was beautiful to watch, but it also made me wonder where that left me in the family dynamic. Update 1. It's been 2 months now, and I honestly don't know how to feel about any of this anymore. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement until his ex-wife got back on her feet has started to feel more and more permanent, and I'm beginning to suspect that might not be entirely accidental. The kids have started calling our house home when they're with their mom instead of switching between mom's house and dad's house like they used to. At first I thought it was sweet, a sign that they felt secure and settled, but then I started to notice other changes that made me less comfortable. His ex-wife has been making improvements to the guest room that go beyond just making it livable. She's painted the walls, hung up pictures, and even bought new furniture. When I mentioned to my husband that it seemed like she was settling in pretty permanently, he said he thought it was nice that she was making the space feel like home for herself and that it probably helped the kids feel more stable too. But here's what really started to bother me. She's been taking over more and more of what used to be my responsibilities in the house. Not in an aggressive way, but in a way that feels like she's naturally sliding back into the role of wife and mother in this household. She's doing the grocery shopping because she knows what everyone likes. She's handling the kids' school communications because she's always done that. She's coordinating everyone's schedules and making sure appointments get made. At first, I was actually grateful for the help. My job had been getting more demanding, and having someone else handle some of the household management freed up time and mental energy. But then I realized that I was becoming peripheral to the running of my own household. Decisions were being made without consulting me, routines were being established that I had no input on, and I was starting to feel like I was the extra person in this family unit rather than an integral part of it. The worst part is that when I try to bring up these concerns with my husband, he acts like I'm being petty or jealous. He keeps emphasizing how much better things are for the kids, how much less stressed everyone seems, how smoothly the household is running. And he's not wrong about any of that. The kids are thriving, the house is more organized than it's ever been, and there's less daily chaos around things like meal planning and coordinating schedules. But I'm miserable, and I feel guilty about being miserable because the situation really is working well for everyone else. 3 weeks ago, Something happened that made all my underlying concerns crystallize into something more concrete. The school called about an emergency involving the 7-year-old. Nothing serious. Just a playground accident that required someone to come pick him up and maybe take him to urgent care to check for a concussion. I was the one who answered the phone because I happened to be working from home that day. But when I said I'd come get him, the school secretary seemed confused. She said they had his mother listed as the primary emergency contact and asked if I was sure his mother wasn't available. When I explained that I was his stepmother and that his mother was living with us temporarily, there was this awkward pause before she said she'd need to check with the principal about the authorization. It turned out that his ex-wife had updated the school records to reflect her current address, our address, but had also removed me as an authorized pickup person and emergency contact. When I confronted her about it later, she was apologetic and said it had been an oversight, that she'd been updating so much paperwork with the address change that she'd accidentally reverted to the old contact list. But my husband had been listed as the secondary contact, and she was listed as primary just like when they were married. It felt like I was being systematically erased from the kids' official records, replaced by their real family unit. When I brought this up with my husband, he said I was reading too much into what was obviously just an administrative mistake. But then I started paying closer attention to other things. Parent-teacher conferences were being scheduled with just the two of them. School volunteer opportunities were being coordinated between them without including me. Even birthday party invitations for the kids' friends were being addressed to both of them at our address. It was like the outside world was seeing them as a family unit again, and I was becoming invisible. But the thing that really made me start questioning what was actually happening came last month, when I overheard a phone conversation his ex-wife was having with what sounded like a potential landlord. She was explaining that she was currently in a temporary living situation, but that she was looking for something long-term for her and her children. Here's the thing though, she was being very vague about her timeline for moving. When the person asked when she'd be available to move in, she said she was flexible and could take her time finding the right place. That doesn't sound like someone who's desperately trying to find housing, so she can stop imposing on her ex-husband and his new wife. I started wondering if this whole arrangement had been less about emergency housing and more about testing the waters for something more permanent. And maybe that's a terrible thing to think, but the way she's settled in so completely, the way she's taken over so many household functions, the way she and my husband have fallen back into patterns that clearly echo their marriage, it all feels very deliberate. Last week I did something I'm not proud of, but I needed to understand what was really going on. I looked at her laptop while she was in the shower. I know it's a violation of privacy and I feel terrible about it, but I was starting to feel like I was going crazy with all the mixed signals and gaslighting. What I found made my stomach drop. She'd been looking at apartments for months, but not seriously. She'd browsed listings and even contacted a few landlords, but she hadn't submitted any applications or made any real effort to secure housing. More concerning, she'd been having long email conversations with friends and family about the living situation, and the tone of those conversations suggested that moving back in with my husband had always been part of a larger plan. In one email to her sister, she'd written about how much happier the kids were with both parents in the same house, and how she thought it might be worth exploring whether they could make it work long-term. In another message to a friend, she'd mentioned that she thought my husband was starting to remember why they'd been good together, and that maybe their divorce had been a mistake made during a difficult period rather than a reflection of fundamental incompatibility. The most painful email was one where she'd written about me. She wasn't cruel or anything, but she described me as someone who was nice enough, but who didn't really understand the kids or the family dynamic the way she did. She'd written that she thought my husband had been trying to replace the family he'd lost when they divorced, but that you can't really replace that kind of history and connection. Reading that felt like being punched in the stomach. Not because it was necessarily wrong, but because it articulated fears I'd been trying not to acknowledge. Was I just a placeholder while my husband figured out that what he really wanted was his original family back together? I confronted my husband with what I'd found, and the conversation didn't go well. He was angry that I'd invaded his ex-wife's privacy, and he accused me of looking for problems where none existed. He said that of course she'd been exploring the idea of staying longer term. The arrangement was working well for everyone, and it made financial sense for all of us. But when I asked him directly if he wanted his ex-wife to stay permanently, he couldn't give me a straight answer. He kept talking about what was best for the kids and what made practical sense, but he wouldn't address what he actually wanted for our marriage and our future together. That's when I realized that maybe I'd been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of wondering whether his ex-wife was trying to manipulate the situation to move back in permanently, maybe I should have been wondering whether my husband wanted her to. Update 2. I'm writing this from my sister's house, where I've been staying for the past 2 weeks. I never thought my marriage would end like this, but I'm starting to think that maybe it was heading in this direction long before his ex-wife moved in. Maybe her presence just forced us to confront problems that had been lurking under the surface all along. After my last update, things continued to deteriorate at home. My husband and I were barely speaking, and when we did talk, it usually turned into arguments about boundaries, respect, and what we each wanted from our marriage. His ex-wife seemed to sense the tension and started making herself scarce when we were in the same room, but that almost made things worse because it highlighted how awkward the situation had become. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during what should have been a normal family dinner. The 4 of them, my husband, his ex-wife, and both kids, were talking about summer vacation plans. Apparently, they'd been discussing the possibility of renting a beach house for a week, something they used to do when they were married. I wasn't included in the conversation initially, which had become pretty typical. I'd gotten used to being on the periphery of family planning discussions, treated more like a roommate than a spouse. But when I asked about the dates they were considering, thinking I'd need to request time off work, the 10-year-old looked at me with genuine confusion and asked why I would need to know. That's when I realized that they hadn't been planning a family vacation that included me. They'd been planning a family vacation that was just the 4 of them, the original family unit reconstituted. When I looked at my husband for clarification, he had the decency to look embarrassed, but he didn't correct the assumption or clarify that of course I'd be included. Instead, he suggested that maybe it would be good for the kids to have some special time with just their parents, and that I could maybe plan my own vacation with friends or family during that time. He said it so casually, like it was perfectly reasonable to exclude your wife from family vacation planning. That night, I packed a bag and told him I needed some time to think. I said I'd be staying with my sister for a few days and that we needed to have a serious conversation about our marriage when I got back. He seemed surprised that I was so upset and kept insisting that I was overreacting to what had been just a casual conversation about possibilities. But I wasn't overreacting, and I think deep down he knew it. What had happened at dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of being gradually pushed out of my own family. I'd been replaced systematically and probably unconsciously by someone who fit more naturally into the life my husband really wanted. During my time at my sister's house, I did a lot of thinking about what I actually wanted and what I was willing to accept. My sister, who'd been watching this whole situation unfold from the outside, helped me see some things more clearly. She pointed out that even if his ex-wife moved out tomorrow, the fundamental problem would remain. My husband had shown me that when forced to choose between my feelings and his ex-wife's needs, he'd choose her every time. It wasn't necessarily malicious or even conscious, but it revealed something about his priorities and about how he saw our marriage in relation to his responsibilities as a father and his connection to his children's mother. I wasn't his primary family, I was an addition to his primary family, and when those two things came into conflict, the addition was expendable. After a week of being away, I went back to the house to get more of my things and to have the conversation I'd been avoiding. I'd expected to find things much the same as I'd left them, but instead I walked into what looked like a completely remodeled family home. His ex-wife had rearranged the living room furniture to better accommodate the kids' play area. She'd hung new curtains in the kitchen and added plants throughout the house. Most tellingly, there were new family photos on the mantle, pictures of my husband with the kids, pictures of his ex-wife with the kids, and pictures of all 4 of them together. The photos of my husband and me from our wedding and various trips had been moved to less prominent locations or removed entirely. When I commented on the changes, my husband said his ex-wife had been trying to make the house feel more like home for the kids, and that he thought the updates looked nice. He didn't seem to understand why I found it problematic that another woman had redecorated our shared living space, or why the photo changes felt like an erasure of our relationship. But the conversation I'd come to have became unnecessary when I found out that his ex-wife's housing search had been even less serious than I'd thought. She'd been approved for 2 different apartments in the past month but had turned them both down for reasons that seemed minor. One was on the 2nd floor, and she preferred ground level, Another didn't allow pets even though she didn't have any pets. When I asked my husband about this, he admitted that they'd been discussing the possibility of her staying permanently. Not just until she found a place, but actually moving in as a long-term arrangement. He said it made financial sense for everyone, that the kids were happier and more stable, and that they'd all been functioning well as a household. What he didn't say, but what was implied in everything he did say, was that he'd been happier too. Happier with his original family back together, even if it was in a different configuration than before. Happier with someone who understood his rhythms and preferences and history in a way that I, despite 4 years of marriage, still didn't. I asked him directly if he wanted to work on our marriage, or if he wanted to continue building this alternative family structure he'd created. I told him that I couldn't be part of an arrangement where I was a secondary figure in my own home, where major decisions about our life together were made without my input, where I was excluded from family activities and planning. His answer was honest in a way that was both refreshing and heartbreaking. He said he didn't know what he wanted, but that he wasn't willing to ask his ex-wife to leave if it meant disrupting the kids' stability and happiness. He said he thought maybe we could all find a way to make it work long-term, that maybe the traditional model of nuclear family wasn't the only way to create a loving, supportive home environment. In theory, he wasn't wrong. There are lots of different family structures that work well for the people involved. But this particular arrangement only worked if I was willing to accept a fundamentally diminished role in my own marriage and household. It worked if I was okay being the extra person in a family unit that was complete without me. I told him I wasn't okay with that, and that if he wasn't willing to prioritize our marriage and work on rebuilding the boundaries and partnership we'd lost, then I didn't think we had a future together. He asked for more time to think about it, but I realized that the fact that he needed time to think about whether he wanted to prioritize his marriage over his living arrangement with his ex-wife was actually my answer. Final update. I'm writing this final update because I know some people have been following this situation and wondering how it all turned out. It's been 6 months since I moved out of the house I shared with my husband, and 3 months since our divorce was finalized. I wish I could say it all worked out with some perfect resolution, but real life is messier than that. My ex-husband and his ex-wife are still living together with the kids, and from what I can tell through mutual friends, they seem to be happy with the arrangement. They haven't gotten remarried or anything dramatic like that, but they've settled into what looks like a functional family unit. The kids are doing well in school, they've maintained their friendships and activities, and they seem emotionally stable and secure. I have complicated feelings about all of this. On one hand, I'm glad the kids are thriving, and that their parents found a way to co-parent that works for everyone involved. Children shouldn't have to suffer because adults can't figure out how to get along, and it sounds like they've created a loving, stable home environment. On the other hand, I can't help but feel like I was collateral damage in their family reunification. Not intentionally or maliciously, but I was definitely the person who got pushed out so that their preferred family structure could be rebuilt. And while I understand the logic of prioritizing the children's well-being, it still hurts to know that my marriage was considered expendable in that calculation. The divorce itself was relatively straightforward, since we didn't have kids together, and had kept most of our finances separate. I was able to move out of my sister's place and into my own apartment after a couple of months. It's smaller than the house I shared with my ex-husband, but it's mine in a way that place never really felt like mine, especially toward the end. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what went wrong and what I could have done differently. Some people have suggested that I should have put my foot down earlier, that I should have insisted on clearer boundaries from the beginning, that I should have given my husband an ultimatum before things got so complicated. Maybe they're right. Maybe if I'd been more assertive about my needs and expectations, we could have found a way to help his ex-wife without completely restructuring our marriage. Maybe if I'd been better at communicating my feelings before resentment built up, we could have worked together to find a solution that worked for everyone. But I also think that the fundamental problem wasn't really about boundaries or communication skills. The problem was that my husband had never fully committed to building a new family with me. Part of him had always been looking backward to the family he'd lost when his first marriage ended, and when the opportunity arose to reconstruct that family in a new form, he chose that over the family we'd been trying to build together. I don't think he did it consciously, or with any intention of hurting me. I think he genuinely believed that he could have both his relationship with me and his idealized version of his original family unit. But when those two things came into conflict, His choice revealed what had always been true. I was an addition to his life, not an integral part of it. The hardest part of this whole experience has been letting go of the relationship I had with his kids. I'd grown to love them over the 4 years we were together, and I'd started to think of myself as their stepmother in a real meaningful way. But once I moved out, contact with them became complicated and eventually stopped altogether. My ex-husband said he thought it would be confusing for them to maintain a relationship with me, and his ex-wife agreed. They felt it was better for the kids to have clear, simple family boundaries rather than trying to explain why their dad's ex-wife was still part of their lives. I understood their reasoning, but it felt like losing 2 children at the same time I was losing my marriage. I've started seeing someone new. A colleague I've been friendly with for years who asked me out about 2 months ago. It's early days and I'm being very careful not to rush into anything serious, but it's been nice to remember what it feels like to be someone's first choice. He doesn't have kids or an ex-wife, which initially made me worry that he wouldn't understand the complexities that come with blended families. But then I realized that maybe what I need right now is someone whose life is less complicated. Someone who can focus on building something new with me, rather than trying to manage relationships and obligations from previous chapters of his life. There's something to be said for starting fresh with someone who doesn't have divided loyalties or competing priorities. I've also been spending more time with friends and family, picking up hobbies I'd let slide during my marriage, and generally rebuilding my life as a single person. It's been harder than I expected in some ways. I'd gotten used to being part of a couple, and there are still moments when I feel lonely or wonder if I made the right choice. But there are also moments when I feel relieved and free in ways I hadn't expected. I can make decisions about my living space without consulting anyone else. I can plan my weekends based on what I want to do rather than coordinating around other people's schedules and needs. I can have friends over without worrying about whether it's inconvenient for anyone else, or whether there's enough privacy for multiple families sharing one house. Most importantly, I'm not constantly walking on eggshells, trying to navigate someone else's complicated family dynamics or wondering whether I'm being too sensitive about feeling excluded from my own life. I'm not having to compete for attention and consideration with an ex-wife who will always have a stronger claim to my partner's loyalty because of their shared children. Looking back, I think the situation was probably doomed from the moment my ex-husband made the decision to invite his ex-wife to move in without discussing it with me first. Not because it was inherently a terrible idea, but because it revealed fundamental differences in how we viewed our marriage and our responsibilities to each other. He saw our relationship as one of many important relationships in his life, significant, but not necessarily primary when it came into conflict with other obligations. I saw our marriage as the foundation that everything else should be built around, the partnership that should be protected and prioritized even when that meant making difficult choices about other relationships. Neither of those perspectives is wrong necessarily, but they're incompatible when it comes to building a life together. You can't have a strong marriage if both partners aren't committed to making that marriage the primary relationship in their lives. And you can't build trust and intimacy if major life decisions are made unilaterally, even if they're made with good intentions. I don't regret trying to make it work. I think it was worth attempting to find a solution that could meet everyone's needs, and I'm glad I gave my ex-husband the opportunity to choose our marriage if that's what he'd wanted to do. But I also don't regret leaving when it became clear that he wasn't willing or able to make that choice. Sometimes love isn't enough if the people involved want fundamentally different things, or have incompatible visions of what their life together should look like. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to step away and let them build the family structure that actually makes them happy, even if it doesn't include you. I'm still figuring out what comes next, but for the first time in months, I feel like I'm moving forward, rather than just trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. And maybe that's the most important thing, not whether any of us got the outcome we originally wanted, but whether we all ended up in situations where we can be honest about what we need and build lives that actually fulfill us. The kids have 2 parents who are committed to their well-being, and who found a way to provide them with stability and love. My ex-husband has the family structure he apparently always wanted, even if he couldn't admit that to himself or to me while we were married. And I have the opportunity to build something new with someone who sees me as essential rather than optional. It's not the happy ending I would have written for any of us, but it's honest, and maybe that's better than trying to force something that was never going to work for everyone involved.